Hello, welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to our course Readings in Philippine History by John P. Candelaria and Veronica C. Alphorha. And for today's session, we are going to discuss the remaining topics for Chapter 1. So we are done with the definition of history and the issues in history. So in today's session, we will delve into its sources and methodology. So first, what we will discuss. So we will be discussing the differences between history and historian. The Annales School of History, it is one of the school of thoughts. Third is the historical sources. We'll be knowing what is or what are the differences between the primary source, secondary source, and we are going to examine the internal criticism and external criticism. Next, we have the Philippine historiography. So our first discussion is all about the history and historian. So if history is written with agenda or is heavily influenced by the historian, is it possible to come up with an empirical truth? Is history an objective discipline? If it is not, is it still worthwhile to study history? Yes, it is still worthwhile to study history because history gives importance to us. If not, is it important to study history? So with this, indeed, an accurate account of the past is impossible for the very simple reason that we cannot go back the past, or we cannot access the past directly as our subject matter. That is why history is an exact and accurate account of the past. Next. So historians only get to access representation of the past through historical sources and evidences. Yes, because historians can only understand and interpret the past by relying on the information provided by historical sources and evidences, emphasizing the importance of primary documents and the artifacts in reconstructing and analyzing historical events. Next, therefore, it is the historian's job not just to seek historical evidences and facts, but also to interpret these facts. In addition to gathering information, historians are tasked with the crucial responsibility of interpreting these facts. That is why dili lang not just to seek historical evidences, but also to interpret these historical evidences or these facts. Okay? Next, because facts cannot speak for themselves. That is why historian must interpret and contextualize facts to derive significance or to draw conclusion. So in other words, facts require interpretation and analysis to be meaningful and informative. And that is, the facts cannot speak for themselves. So, dapat dyan ang historian mag-interpret and mag-contextualize sa facts to derive a significance or to draw a conclusion because facts cannot speak for themselves. Next is, it is the job of the historian to give meaning. It is one of the role and responsibility of an historian to give meaning to these facts and organize into a timeline, establish causes, and write history. That's why a historian is not a passive recorder, but rather an engaged interpreter who critically analyzes and contextualize historical facts. Nag-offer siya og mga insights and perspectives, of course, to illuminate the complexities of the past. So, mao na dapat organize ang historian. Next, historian is a person, tao ni siya ang historian ha? Tao ni siya. So historian is a person of his own who is influenced by his own context, environment, ideology, education, and of course, his influences. In that sense, um, historians' interpretation of the historical facts is affected by his context and circumstances. And also, his subjectivity, we are referring here to a historian, ha? His subjectivity will inevitably influence the process of his historical research. First is the method that he will use. What is or what are the ways or techniques that he will be using in his or her historical research? Next, the facts that he shall select and deem relevant. Muna itong ginaingon nga select, and collect the best facts. Next, his interpretation. Yes, of course, if you have all the historical sources or evidences, you really need to interpret this well because facts cannot speak for themselves. So it is one of the roles and responsibilities of a historian to have a well interpretation of his research. Next, and even the form of his writing. Isa po ni siya sa mga bases in the process of doing historical research. Kung unsa nga mode of language imong gigamit, unsa nga dialect, is it Gothic ba or archaic nga mga words or just a simple words? Okay? Next is, thus, in one way or another, of course, we can conclude that history is always subjective. Historical research requires rigor. So it requires an exact and thorough examination because you will never get a successful documentation if you don't have this rigor or kanang you have an exact and thorough examination of your historical research. So dapat imo dyan na siyang ipang scrutinize, imong ipang analyze or i-examine mo critically. Oh, ana siya. Next, historical methodology. It comprises certain techniques and rules that historians follow. Oh, na siya i-follow in order to properly utilize sources and historical evidences in writing history. And this is the way on how to study past and what are the techniques to use all the sources that they gathered. So dapat na sila i-follow in order to utilize sources and historical evidences in writing documents about past events or writing history. For example, if a historian chooses to use an oral account, oral account ang gibutang dinhi ang iyahang method. So if a historian chooses to use an oral account as his data in studying the ethnic history of the Ifugaos in the Cordilleras during American occupation, so he needs to validate the claims of his informant through comparing and corroborating it with written sources. So ang methodology nga gigamit dinhi is an oral account nga iyahang studyhan talks about the history of Ifugaos in Cordilleras during American occupation. So, with the use of oral account, dapat ang kaning historian iya pang i-validate ang mga claims sa iyahang informant. Iya na siyang i-compare and i-corroborate with written sources or written documents. Because if the oral account or ang mga sabi-sabi, then that would be possible and the historians need to validate the claims of his informant through comparing and corroborating it with written sources. So dili lang sila mag-rely on the oral account, dapat sila another historical source or evidence nga ilang i-compare and corroborate ang iyang oral account o katong mga documents para ato na siyang ibangga kung tama pud ba ang iyahang giistorya sa oral account o sa written account, no? Naatay validation of the claims. Another, the historian needs not to let his bias blind. His judgment and such bias is only acceptable if he maintains his rigor as a researcher. So dapat i-maintain gihapon sa historian ang iyahang rigor as a researcher. Nga dapat na siya thorough examination of all historical sources. Here is the Annales School of History. It is a school of history born in France that challenged the canons of history. So take note that the Annales School of History, it is one of the school of thought or school of history that was born in France. This school of thought, or this school of thought did away with the common historical subjects that were almost related to the conduct of state and monarchs. So, not only monarch or elites are always be here in terms of history. They are more concerned with those simple person and need nila studihan ang ilang history. And that's the best thing about the Annales School of Thought. And they are more concerned in social history and studied longer historical period. And that is the Annales School of History. And now, moving on to the different historical sources. So, with the past as the history subject matter, the historian's most important research tool of the historian. Again, the most important research tool of historian is the historical sources or evidences. So in general, historical sources can be classified between primary sources and secondary sources. So ato siyang isa-isahon. But take note that the classification of the sources between two categories depends. Balik ko na to ha. Depends on the historical subject being studied. So first is the primary sources. Are those sources produced at the same time? I'm gonna produce at the same time as the event, period, or subject being studied. And for instance, if the historian wishes to study the Commonwealth Constitution Convention of 1935, so these are the following, the primary sources can include. First is the minutes of convention, newspaper clippings, Philippine Commission reports of the U.S. commissioners. Fourth is the records of the convention, and lastly is the draft of the Constitution, and naapa ang photographs of the event. And even the eyewitness account of convention delegates and their memoirs can also be used as a primary source. Next. So these are the example of primary sources, the archival documents, the artifacts, the memorabilia, the letters, the census, and of course, the government records. So these are some of the example of primary sources. Now, proceeding to the secondary sources, are those sources which were produced by an author who use primary sources to produce the material. So, gigamit nila ang primary source to produce another material. So, in other words, secondary sources are historical sources which studied a certain historical subject. So, the classification of sources between the primary and secondary depends. So, magdepende yun na siya, no? Magdepende not on the period when the source was produced or type of the source, but on the subject of the historical research. So magdepende din na siya kung unsa imong subject of your historical research. Like for example, a textbook is usually classified as secondary source or tertiary event. Diba? Muna ito naandan nga ang textbook is a primary source, is a secondary source or tertiary event. So if a historian chooses to write the history of education in 1980s, of course, ang historian, he can utilize textbook as a primary source. Kaya mo atong balikan nga it depends on yes, it depends not on the period when the subject when the source was produced or the type of source, but nagiingon nga but on the subject of the historical research. So kaya ang atong example diri it talks about the history of mo ang subject, history of education in 1980s. So considered sa historian din nga ang textbook considered siya as a primary source. Yun. Next. So take note that both primary and secondary sources are useful in writing and learning history. Very useful ni siya in writing and learning history. However, ang mga historian and kamo, mga students of history, you really need to thoroughly scrutinize. Ato din siyang i-examine carefully ang mga historical sources para ma-avoid nato ang deception and lies. No, ang mailad nga kanang mailad ta nga with the use of their words. So dapat ato silang i-thoroughly scrutinize para to come up with a historical truth. Okay? Next. So the historian should be able to conduct an external and internal criticism of the sources, especially in the primary source, which can age centuries. At tanawon, what's the differences between this criticism? First is the internal criticism, is the practice of verifying the authenticity of evidence by examining its physical characteristics. No? Naka-highlight na physical characteristics. Kaya if we say external ba yan, na siya sa gawas. So, verify atong gi-verify diri ang authenticity of evidence by examining its physical characteristics, the consistency with historical characteristics of the time when it was produced, and the materials used for evidences. So unsa nga mga external criticism or physical characteristics ang ato ang i-examine? So like for example, these are the example of the things that we will be examining when conducting an external criticism. Of course, ang types of paper, saan na siya nga long size, saan na siya nga brand, the type of ink, kana bang red, blue, yellow, or black, or whatever it is, ang say brand po ana, and the language and the language and words used in materials. So kung mga basic words na ba na siya or mga deep words or mga archaic words and among others. And the thickness even, isa po na siya sa ato ang gi-examine in terms of external criticism. Again, external criticism, it examines about the physical characteristics. Next, we have the internal criticism. If we say external gawas, so internal, not sa sulod, or even the content of the source and examine the circumstances of its production. So ang gi-examine naning internal criticism is the truthfulness of the evidence. Kung tama ba ni ang mga gipangbutang nimo nga mga historical sources or evidences sa imuhang gistudihan or sa imuhang historical research. So in short, ang external criticism, it examines the physical characteristics, and the internal criticism, it examines the truthfulness of the evidences of your historical research. Therefore, internal criticism looks at the truthfulness and factuality. So, ikitanaw din hiya ang truthfulness and factuality of the evidences by looking at the author of the source, ang saang context and the agenda behind its creation, and the knowledge which informed it and its intended purpose, or even ani iyahang purpose. Ang say purpose aning historical research, isa po ni siya sa i-examine ni internal criticism. And internal criticism entails that the historian acknowledge and analyze how such reports can be manipulated to be used in a war propaganda. And without thorough criticism, without thorough criticism, both internal and external, of historical evidences, of course, historical deception and lies will be highly probable. So, nadyo'y mailad jud ta kung dili nato i-examine ang kaning mga historical research. Kay giingon din niya, without thorough criticism, di ba? Klaro kayo? Without thorough criticism, historical deception and lies will be highly probable. So, possible yun siya. And of course, if you are a historian, the task of the historian is to look at the available historical sources and iselect niya the most relevant and meaningful for history for subject matter that he is studying to come up with a meaningful and very informative historical research. So dapat iya dyan iselect ang mga most relevant and meaningful historical sources or evidences in studying certain historical research. And always remember that history, like other academic discipline, has come a long way, but still has a lot of remaining tasks to do. It does not claim to render absolute and exact judgment because as long as, no, because as long as questions are continuously asked and as long as time unfolds, the study of history can never be complete. Kung naa pa ni mga occurring questions or mga issues or concern about sa mga historical research, then the study of history or the study of your historical research can never be complete. Dapat pag ma-produce na siya nimo nga historical research, there will be no questions na about your historical research. And for our last discussion, we have here the Philippine historiography. It is just a very short discussion. So Philippine historiography, it's underwent several changes since the pre-colonial period until the present. So this it talks about sa history lang po about the Philippines. And ancient Filipinos narrated their history through communal songs and epics that they pass orally from a generation to generation. As what I've said, nga, sa unang panahon, dili pa kayo uso ang pagsulat and what are the means of writing. So sa una, generate lang nila ilang history through communal songs and epics, no? Ilan siyang i-share through generation by generation. And that is the Philippine historiography. And thank you so much for listening with our session today. And I hope that you learned something new with our discussion. If you have questions, feel free to comment down below if you have questions. Thank you so much and thank you for listening.